Today we're reading Chapter 7, The Disappearance of Ginger Pye on Thanksgiving Day. Ginger was a quite famous dog now in Cranberry for his achievement on the school fire escape and for other happy ventures. Almost everyone knew him and liked him. He had a great many friends he liked to call on. When visiting, he never cut across people's lawns, unless, of course, distracted by a cat. He always walked up the sidewalk or up the driveway, the polite way that people do. He had a comical sideways gait, and it was an amusing sight to see him purposefully walking up the street and turning onto somebody's walk and trotting up on the porch and scratching at the door to be let in for a visit and a pat and perhaps a bone. "Here comes Ginger Pye," the people would say, delighted to be honored with a visit from such a famous dog. It was impossible to think of Ginger having one single enemy in the whole wide world, and the Pyes had long ago tucked away all thoughts of the unsavory character in the backs of their minds. For there had been no more suspicious happenings since the first few days of Ginger's coming into the family. The Pyes were all proud of their famous dog, though of course they did not boast of him. Now Ginger was going to be even more famous than ever before, though not this time through a happy way, for a dreadful thing happened. Ginger disappeared. The terrible discovery was made at 4 o'clock in the afternoon on Thanksgiving Day, right after the Pyes had finished dinner. Mr. Pye had returned the night before from another trip, this time to the Sea Islands, to study more birds. Grandma and Grandpa and Uncle Benny were also here, and dinner had lasted a very long time. This was natural, since it was Thanksgiving Day, and there were 3 roast chickens and plenty of drumsticks. Ginger had grown tired of all the talking and the eating, and he had scratched at the door to be let out. "Don't let the puppy out front," said Mrs. Pye. Oops. "Mrs. Carruthers and Mrs. Gaines are sick and tired of all the barking and chasing of their cats. Let us have some peace and quiet on Thanksgiving Day." So Jerry let Ginger out the back door into their own enclosed backyard. They heard Ginger crying piteously for a time because he had wanted to seek adventure on the street. Instead, there he was in the backyard with no possibility of getting out. At least that's what everyone thought. The backyard had high board fences on 3 sides of it, and on the 4th side, the front side, wire fencing joined up with the board fences. Currant bushes grew along the wire fence, and they were spiky and cold-looking in the November air. The wire fence and the board fences were all in good condition. There were no loose boards or holes, and Ginger could not get out. Yet Ginger had gotten out. And how? That was what everybody wanted to know. Jerry was the one who made the discovery. When dinner was at last over, he'd gone out to play with his lonesome dog. But there was no dog, lonesome or otherwise. He was gone. It would be impossible to explain why Jerry had such a terrible sinking feeling in the pit of his stomach. It seemed to him that the emptiness in the backyard was a long-time emptiness, that Ginger had been gone for a long while. "Someone must have let Ginger back into the house without my knowing it," he thought. But no one had. Still, perhaps he had gotten out somehow on someone's heels without being noticed, perhaps when Mama went out for celery. Once he was in, perhaps Gracie the cat had unlatched the front door for him in her unusual for a cat manner. But Gracie the cat was innocently and languorously sprawled on the mantel. The latch was tightly fastened on the front door. No one had let Ginger in or out of any door except Jerry when he let him out the back one into the backyard. And the backyard was where he should still be, safe and sound. It was unbelievable that Ginger was not there. Somewhere, and Jerry went to the back door and whistled. Nothing but empty silence answered. Jerry then toured the house, the bedrooms, the parlor, even Papa's study in the tower, but Ginger most certainly was not at home. Rachel was helping Mama and Grandma with the dishes, and there were mountains of those. It looked as though dishwashing would last a week. Uncle Benny was curled up asleep on the couch in the living room, having had too much to eat. "Take a little nap, take a little nap," Grandma had urged him. And this time Uncle Benny had not refused. Grandpa and Papa were in the little parlor sitting on the scratchy horsehair furniture, talking in low tones in order not to wake up Uncle Benny. No one was as excited as Jerry about the disappearance of Ginger, except for Rachel. "Oh, he probably got out of the yard somehow and is off chasing cats," Mama said reassuringly. It might be true, Jerry thought. Nobody in Cranberry had such a smart puppy as he had. A puppy that could trail a boy through the streets and climb up the fire escape at school and find Jerry in his own room, room 9, at school, and bring his pencil to him that he had lost somewhere along the way. It would not be too surprising for such a dog as that to find a way to get out of the backyard. Perhaps he had dug a hole under the fence, and perhaps he was somewhere in the neighborhood. Later, Jerry would examine all the fences and stop up whatever hole he had dug. So Jerry went out the front door and down the street a ways, and he whistled for Ginger. 7 short whistles with an up tilt on the last whistle, the way he always did, and then he listened. Whistled like this. My whistle isn't too good today, sorry. No little brown and white dog came tearing like dynamite. Nowhere in the neighborhood was there the sound of Ginger's special cat and chicken barking. The silence of Thanksgiving Day, with everyone sitting around and stomachs full and eyes heavy, was the only answer to Jerry's whistling. Except for that time when Ginger had trailed Jerry to school, as far as anyone knew, Ginger had never left their block before. His going away like this was puzzling, and it was frightening. Jerry ran next door to ask Dick Badger if he had seen his dog, but no one answered the bell, and then he remembered that Dick's family was spending the day with the Badger clan in Cheshire. Disconsolately, Jerry returned home where everyone was still doing the same things. Rachel looked at Jerry, and she was as anxious and panic-stricken as he was. After all, it had been he and she together who had heard the mysterious footsteps that first night long ago and seen the yellow hat of the unsavory character in the lamplight and up at the reservoir. And she loved Ginger as much as Jerry did, and Ginger was as much her dog as it was Jerry's, with the exception that it had been Jerry's idea in the first place, not hers. She dropped her dishcloth and looked pleadingly at her mother. Her mother nodded her head. "Call in Mr. Pye," she said, referring to the way men in Washington always spoke. "Call in Mr. Pye," they'd say whenever they got in a bird jam. This was not a bird jam. It was a dog jam and a dishwashing jam. But in his family, it didn't matter what sort of jam it was. "Call in Mr. Pye" suited every occasion. Papa and Grandpa obligingly came in from the parlor, rolled up their shirt sleeves, and fell onto the dishes, meanwhile reminiscing about KP duty in the Army. Rachel and Jerry grabbed their coats and hats from the rack by the door and hurried out the house. Mama followed them to the door. "I'm sure he's not far away," she told them, giving them both a good luck hug and kiss. "Now hurry back before it gets too dark." Somehow this made Jerry and Rachel want to cry. "Shucks," she thought Jerry. "He must be right around here somewhere." Still, neither one of the children said anything that might reassure the other. To both of them, the possibility was too real that they might not find Ginger, that Ginger might be gone completely and forever. They both had an awful feeling that this might be so. First, they went to every yard in their block and all around the square of the block. They whistled for him and they called, "Ginger, Ginger, here pup, here pup." But Ginger was not anywhere right around home, that was certain. They buttoned up their coats tighter and they went farther and farther, up one street and down another, whistling and calling all the time. It was a cold day, and a very fine snow, the first of winter, began to fall. After a while, a thin gossamer layer glistened everywhere, and it was cold and damp underfoot. "He'll be cold," said Jerry. "Out all this time." "Oh, Ginger," gasped Rachel, hardly able to bear that they didn't at least know where he was. She knew not to cry, though, because she was 9 years old, and children that age did not cry in Cranberry. Here's a picture of them calling for Ginger. She usually managed not to cry anymore when she felt like crying. Until now, when they couldn't find Ginger, the main times when she found it almost impossible not to cry were the times in school when an awfully sad story was being read out loud. Evangeline was one of these awfully sad stories, and sometimes Rachel had to press her fingers to her ears, trying not to hear. But she heard anyway, and she kept swallowing hard to keep from crying out loud and disgracing herself and all the girls of 9 in general. She would dry her tears on her petticoat under her desk, hoping it was supposed she had a cold. Stories of old men also made her cry. There was the old man in Hans Brinker. Then there was one dreadful story about an old man which the teacher in room 4 had read to the class. The man in this story was so feeble he spilled food all over himself and with shaking hands. He made such a mess the family made him eat at a bench behind the kitchen stove while they ate somewhere else away from him. Rachel could hardly bear to think of that sad story ever. When Grandpa got that old, she would make him eat right at the table with them all and let him slobber as much as he wanted. It was awful to be put on a bench behind the kitchen stove. Dog stories, especially if there was cruelty involved, made her cry too. Consider Dog of Flanders. Now, not crying over not finding Ginger was even harder than not crying over sad stories. And how could they ever go home without him? Ginger, Ginger pup. They went over to parts of town where they hardly ever went. It was growing dark because there was no daylight savings time anymore. The lonely lights in the houses, looking sad and shrunken in the deepened dusk, were coming on. And still the children plodded on, up one street, around a corner, and down another street, calling all the time or whistling. They had finally woven their way over to the part of town where Grandma lived. They were on Second Avenue, the street where that first day, when they had bought Ginger for $1, they had heard the mysterious footsteps. Maybe here they would find him. They called, Ginger, Ginger, and they whistled 7 short whistles with the up tilt on the last note, and they walked slowly, listening hard between calls and whistles. But they heard nothing, no little yelp or whine saying where their puppy was. They began to knock at the doors of friendly-looking houses. "Have you seen our dog?" they asked. "He's a little brown and white puppy," they said. No one had. They took a quick look in every hall to see if the old felt hat was hanging there, the only clue they had. But they did not see it on any of the pegs they glimpsed. One door that they knocked at happened to be the door of Wally Bullwinkle, the big boy in Jerry's class at school. He acted surprisingly unfriendly. Since the whole class was still talking about Jerry's smart dog, Ginger, and how he had climbed the fire escape, naturally Ginger and Rachel would have expected him to be very concerned about the dog's disappearance, or at least interested. They thought he might ask the men and talk the whole thing over with them, suggesting clues. But they had hardly knocked at the door when it opened a tiny crack, as though Wally Bullwinkle had been right there waiting for him. And Wally whispered to them to get away from here. He said, still in a whisper, no, he had not seen their old dog. And furthermore, he said he had an enormous dog himself. And this dog was so ferocious that Wally had to keep him locked up with heavy chains, so they'd better not come knocking at his door anymore. Jerry and Rachel hurried away from there. "Maybe he didn't have any Thanksgiving dinner," said Rachel, who was always ready to make excuses for anybody, even the unpleasantest people. They recalled a story they had heard of a man over here, somewhere on Second Avenue, who had had his nose bitten off by a dog. Fortunately, a bystander picked the nose up and stuck it back on the man's face where it belonged, and so the story went, held it there until the doctor arrived. The doctor sewed the nose back on, and it was only a little crooked. From then on, the man was known as Bit-Nose Ned. Here's a picture at Wally Bullwinkle's house. Now Jerry and Rachel wondered, supposing it was Wally Bullwinkle's dog that had done this. If so, it was kind of him, after all, to warn them. They'd better take his advice and stay away from the place. Their noses were so little, if they were bitten off, it would not be an easy matter to sew them back on. Then Jerry said, "Pooh, I don't believe Wally has a dog at all. I never heard him say anything about having a dog. He's always boasting about something, that's all." Rachel was silent. She was thinking that, if she was not careful, she might turn into Wally Bullwinkle. Twice yesterday, twice in one day, she had said something that was not true. She wondered if the disappearance of Ginger Pye was a punishment for saying those 2 things that were not true. The first wrong thing she had said yesterday morning was to Mrs. Carruthers when she was running home from school across a lot. Mrs. Carruthers had said to her, "Rachel," she had said, "I suppose you're having turkey for dinner tomorrow." Rachel had said, "No, we're not having turkey, but we're having 3 chickens. Actually, she had been told they were having 2 chickens, which sounded tremendous enough, but in comparison to a turkey, they were probably nothing in Mrs. Carruthers' estimation, so she had tacked one on. As it happened, they had had 3 chickens after all, so the statement was really not untrue. Grandma said the 2 chickens she had chosen were not large enough, and so she brought another as a surprise. However, at the time Rachel told Mrs. Carruthers about having 3, she thought they were only having 2. Therefore, it was a wrong thing to say, especially as she had been ashamed that they were having chicken and not turkey. Yet that was nothing to be ashamed of. The other wrong thing she had said yesterday afternoon to Mrs. Stokes, the lady who had given the big ice cream party. It happened that Rachel and a girl named Muriel Jenks, who had curls and a coat trimmed with white bunny fur, were dancing on Rachel's front yard and turning handsprings. Muriel Jenks went to Miss Chichester's dancing school, and Muriel said, "Why don't you take dancing lessons?" And Rachel said, "I do. I go far, far away, and I take lessons from this teacher who is far, far away." After a while, of course. After all the while, I'm sorry, and all the while, of course, she didn't take dancing lessons at all. This was not so bad, for Muriel would think this was a game of pretending, and Muriel would like to imagine that Rachel had an interesting life somewhere of which she knew nothing. But unfortunately, at this moment, Mrs. Stokes came along. She always seemed to glide up the street. She was so graceful. And she said, "My, what fine little dancers! Where do you take lessons?" she had asked. Muriel had said, "Miss Chichester in Moose Hall." Mrs. Stokes would have gone on then without asking any more questions, but Rachel just piped up and said, "And I take from a teacher that is different, and she teaches far, far away." "That's why she dances that way, not my way," said Muriel. Mrs. Stokes smiled and said that was fine. They both danced beautifully, and they must come and dance for her daughter Nancy sometimes. And then she went on up the street. Rachel looked after Mrs. Stokes in dismay. Where had the words come from? The wrong words. She raced after Mrs. Stokes, and she whispered to her. "Hey," she said, "I don't really take dancing lessons. I said I do, but I don't." And Mrs. Stokes had smiled and said that what a very good joke that was. Rachel looked up at her gratefully and then had run back to Muriel, who wanted to know what had been said, but Rachel didn't answer. Some other time she would tell Muriel about the dancing school joke. Not then. Now, it was possible that these two wrong things she had said were turning her into a Wally Bullwinkle, and that in punishment Ginger was stolen from them. But that could not be, she reasoned hopefully, because after all, Ginger was mostly Jerry's dog, and Jerry had not said the wrong things. Still, from now on, she would never say 3 when it was 2, and she would not say that she also went to dancing school when she didn't. The snow flurry had stopped, but the weather had turned awfully bleak and cold. When they cut across fields, their feet crunched on crisp little frost castles forming. They wiped their noses and they pressed their lips together to keep from sobbing. "Ginger! Ginger!" They gulped. In the end, they had to go home without Ginger. Their only hope now was that perhaps he had shown up at home and was right there all the time that they had been searching the town for him. This hope put speed in their tired toes, and they tried to convince themselves that all this afternoon had been a bad dream from which they would awaken, and they would find everything as it always was at home with Ginger, perhaps charging at the enemy dog in the pier glass mirror. This was not so. They could tell it was not so the minute they got home, because if Ginger had been there, he would be racing to the door to meet them, the way he always did. Instead, it was awfully quiet in the house. Mama and Papa were sitting in the living room looking rather worried, for they'd been gone a long time, and it was nearly 9 o'clock. Uncle Benny and Grandma and Grandpa had not been able to wait for them any longer and had left. Here they are coming home. It was funny that Jerry and Rachel had not passed them, but they must have gone home by the way of Hickory Street instead of 2nd Avenue, where the children had last been, the street of the mysterious footstepper and of Wally Bullwinkle and Bit-Nosed Ned. Rachel and Jerry were too tired and too heavy-hearted to say anything or eat anything, not even the warm milk Mom wanted them to have at last. They went upstairs to bed, and they didn't say anything to each other, and they climbed into their beds, and neither one of them had thought to play the Moombernickel story game, the game they had played every other night for so long they could not remember when it had started. They just crawled into their beds in their own rooms, put their heads down under the covers, and cried. In private, one could cry. On occasions like this, when they had lost their dog, they certainly could cry. Jerry had told himself he'd watched this certain puppy and wanted this certain puppy from when it was only a few days old, and how he had studied this puppy every day and had been impressed with how sweet and smart he was, and how he'd wondered where he would earn the dollar to buy him. He told himself how Sam Duty had come to the rescue, how he had earned the dollar with the help of Rachel and Uncle Benny dusting the pews, and how they had bought the puppy with this dollar they had earned. And Jerry told himself about the tricks he had taught Ginger, and how smart of a dog he was. Ginger knew many tricks now, but Jerry was careful not to boast about him in front of Dick Badger or anybody, but especially not in front of Dick Badger, because Dick's dog, Duke, knew only one trick, how to scratch his stomach when you scratched his back, a certain place on his back. Ginger, on the other hand, when he was only about 10 weeks old, had trailed Jerry to school and had gone up the fire escape, even bringing Jerry the pencil he had lost. Dick Badger's father ran the Cranberry Chronicle, and he had put a story of Ginger on the fire escape in the newspaper, even running a picture of Ginger with a pencil in his mouth under the caption, "Intellectual Dog." The fellow who had also wanted to buy Ginger in the beginning must have seen the story, and it probably made him wilder than ever to get a hold of Ginger. Here's a picture of the newspaper article. Who was it? The same fellow who had stolen Ginger, or who? He'll be cold, thought Rachel, sobbing silently to herself. He'll be wondering where I am, thought Jerry in anguish, and they cried themselves to sleep. Jerry had a dream that Ginger Pye was asleep on his feet the way he always slept. But in the morning when he woke up, this fine dream was shattered because Ginger was certainly gone.